All right, welcome everyone. Today we're going to talk about an introduction to the JavaScript document object model. In part one, we're going to talk about what is the document object model. We're going to talk about iterating through the document object model to graph specific elements. We'll then cover the script tag, what the script tag can offer for us. We'll go over the different query selectors that we can utilize to grab HTML elements from the script tag, or excuse me, from the HTML document. We'll create a function that will actually change text within our document. And then we'll talk about how we can interact with CSS utilizing JavaScript. Now, again, none of this is going to be evaluated. This is just simply for us to understand the fundamentals of how a full stack application actually works. So first, let's talk about a document object model. Now, the document object model, there's an image that we have here. Let me go ahead and copy that. That I really like as a visualization or as a beginning visualization that breaks down the model as such. We have a document that breaks down to a root element, and then from there, we can see everything else that falls within this HTML document. Well, now, I've mentioned before that everything is boxes inside of boxes. So let's take a look at a different representation of this. Let me go ahead, and I believe we did this on 6. We did do this in 6. I'm going to steal this nav, or I'm going to steal, you know what? This doesn't look like what we have today. So let me go ahead and create a new one. All right. So here's what we have today. Currently, we have an HTML document. This document holds a body inside of it. Inside of said body, we have 3 components that I can see, which is a header, a main, and a footer. So I'm going to go ahead and add that there. Inside of my footer, I can see that I have an H6 tag or a division with an H6 tag. So I'm going to go ahead and add that as well. So there I now have a division. And then finally within my division, I have an H6 tag. Okay, so there's my footer. Now let's take a look at the header. The header holds an H1 element. And it also holds a nav element. I may have to just widen this perspective a little bit here. All right. Hi, gorgeous. I apologize, everyone. So there's my H1 element in there. I know that I also hold a nav bar. And inside of my nav bar, I have 3 separate list items. Finally, if I take a look at main, inside of main, I hold 2 division tags that also hold paragraph tags. Now, if I were to think about this from a perspective of a tree, the very first thing I would have would be the document on the very top element. And the document would then fall and have one child. What would that one child be?
The
Body.
body.
Perfect. So we would have a child named Body. The body would have three children. What would the three children of the body be?
Header, main.
Header, main, and footer.
Perfect. So let's go ahead and put that into header. We would also have main, and we would also have footer. Now we could break this down even more, but I'm going to go ahead and pause here because it seems like we have the understanding of how elements belong to a parent, right? So we have three children elements of header, main, and footer that belong to the parent of body. Now this is good to break down the document as a tree, but it doesn't really tell me much about what the document object model actually is. Well, the document object model actually stands for where we can view our entire HTML template as an object. Well, that means that in our JSON object, we have a document key that holds a value of body, which inside of body will hold something else. We're going to take a look at what else it holds inside of it right now. If I were to build this side by side, what would we expect to be inside a body?
Header, main, and footer.
Right, we would expect there to be a header, which would have its own object. We would expect there to be something like main, which would have its own object. And then we would expect there to be something like footer. Let's take a look at our actual template here and see what it brings up. So I'm going to come over to my actual JS DOM, which I'm currently rendering with live server. And I'm going to take a look at the console. Here in the console, I can actually write regular JavaScript. So I can say console.log hello Avenger. And that will actually get executed. We get that log onto the console of hello Avenger. I didn't have a return value, so I get undefined. All right. I'm going to clear my output there. And now I'm going to iterate through this DOM. Let's say I'm trying to get to this about tag. All right. I'm going to go into my document like we specified earlier, and you can see that it's highlighting the entire document for me. It's letting me know, hey, you're referencing the entire document here. All right. If I put dot, because this is an object, I'm going to go ahead and enter the body. All right. And now I'm going to place a dot and see if there's such thing as header. Well, header doesn't exist. If I run this, it returns me undefined. Well, that's because document and body are key elements, right? They do actually exist within our drawing here. And let me actually break this down like this. All right. So document and body actually do exist inside of our object, but header, main, and footer do not. Instead, if we wanted to find the header, main, and footer, I reference to all three of these as a specific keyword here. Does anyone remember what the keyword is that I referenced to it? What's the relationship to body?
The values.
Child.
They're
Elements.
children. Yeah, they are children of the body. So in order for me to be able to find those children, I have to actually enter children. And you'll notice when I enter children, what I get is an HTML collection of 4 separate tags. We're not going to talk about the script tag just yet. So now let's work on our object here. Right, inside of the body, there's no such thing as just header. Instead, we have something called children, which is equal to an array. Let's actually break this down further inside of JavaScript now. So create main.js, we've already discussed. There's such a thing where we have a document that is equal to an object that has a body. This body holds something named children. But children currently doesn't exist. So instead, children is created as an array of objects where inside we have our header, we have our main, and we have our footer. Well, where do all 3 of those come from? Well, all 3 of those would be something like this, where we have a header that also holds a children element that looks like this. Oh, excuse me. We have main, which also holds a children element, which looks such. And then finally, we have the footer, which also holds a children element. All right, so then we have our header, main, footer. We have all of our children that fall within the document model. So what does this look like if we were to iterate through this? Well, if we were to bring it all together, what this would actually look like. Let's call this our master document here. And I'm just doing this to save our, actually, I could just do variable, right? We're going to create our document, which would hold an object where the very first key is of body. This body is also an object that holds children inside of it, which has an array, where in this array, we have such a thing as our header. We have our main. We have our footer. Right? Kind of looks pretty similar to the drawing that we demonstrated earlier. If I go back to TL draw here, we're seeing the breakdown of this tree being reflected by this object. Okay, so let's put this into application. If I wanted to grab the footer, the entire footer element, I would simply enter the document. Oh, excuse me. I would enter the document dot body dot children, and inside of the children, I would grab my second index, which in that case would return the footer. And we can see that it's the footer that is being highlighted. Right? If I run this code, it actually returns to me an HTML element, a footer, where I have access to the division and the H6 tag. All right, so that's how I was able to get to the footer. Can somebody help me write some JavaScript code that will help me get to the second list item? of about.
Document dot body
All right, so we have document dot body.
dot children bracket 0
All right, and bracket 0 would return the entire header.
and then I don't know where to go from here. Oh, there's some hints down there, right?
A little bit, yeah. So if we scroll down, we can see that there's a way for us to grab the H1 tag.
Which is not what we want, right? We're looking for the nav. Is
Right.
that right?
So currently you're in the nav or you're in the
Oh,
header, right? And inside of the header, we have two children. One of them being
this is the H1, right?
H1, and the other being nav.
Children 0. Give it another index of 1. See if that breaks it.
Well, currently right now we're getting the entire header back, right?
Mm-hmm.
So what header, how do I get to this list? Or excuse me, to this
Oh,
array?
You use another dot
dot
children.
children
I would have to say, hey, I want to enter this children
bracket
element.
1.
Perfect. Then
Oh,
I
look, it
say
gives you a hint.
bracket 1. And now it tells me, hey, you're inside the nav bar. And now my nav bar also has children. And within this children, I have 3 list items.
Dot children bracket 2. Maybe not.
Here, and then boom.
Oh,
So we
just
do
right.
dot children.
Bracket 2.
And if we do bracket 2, well, that returns
Oh,
to us
nope.
contact.
1.
Perfect.
Forget
Let's
0
do-
indexed.
Nice. And now we go into the children of 1. That gives us our list item with the correct text here where we have an anchor tag of about. And that's how we iterate through the JavaScript doc. All right. Does anyone have any questions regarding the document object model? How we interpret HTML into a JSON object that we can iterate through with JavaScript?
So we assume document dot body, and then from there it's just different variations of children. Children
Right.
indexes all the way down.
Yes.
Okay.
Andy?
I was just wondering, what's the purpose of this? Because it seems like it will take a very long time to find these things, especially if you don't even know what the HTML looks like.
Yeah, that's a great question. So currently right now what we're doing is we're building the fundamental understanding of what the JavaScript DOM is. But you're right, this would take a ridiculous amount of time to be able to iterate through things over and over again to be able to find information. So that's what query selectors are for. And let's go ahead and dive into that portion now. All right. So currently I'm going to go into index.html. And we know that inside of index.html, I can write CSS by adding a style tag. Well, just like I can write CSS by adding a style tag, I can also write JavaScript by adding a script tag. Now let's talk about the script tag here. There's a couple of different ways to utilize the script tag. Some people like adding it in the header. If you add the script in the header, make sure you utilize this async defer keywords. And we're going to go into why we will have to utilize that async defer keywords here shortly. All right, well, Andy just mentioned, hey, this seems like it's kind of redundant, right? Or why am I even doing this? Well, here in the script tag, I can write console.log and say, hello, Avenger. You'll see that when the file is saved, now I'm getting hello, Avenger on my console. Essentially, the script tag is being executed every single time my browser is rendering. So as HTML document starts rendering, it starts to render my script tag. Well, let's go into a bit of query selectors here. Let's say we have all these li items, Oh, hello. So for all of these list items, I'm going to go ahead and add a class where the class will say nav item. During my async defer, I'm going to go ahead and actually grab all of those list items by class name. And I can do so utilizing a query selector. So let's say list items. And here in the script tag, I'm actually just writing plain JavaScript. So let list items be equal to document dot select, or excuse me, it's called get elements by class name. And here I'm going to simply pass the class name of nav item. And then I'm going to console.log allies so I could see what that returns. Well, now I'm getting an HTML collection, which is an array. This array holds all four or all three of my nav items being located in there. So instead of doing this entire mess of iterating through the entire JavaScript model inside of index.html, all we're doing is we're getting direct access to these items by a class name. All right. Now from there, I can still index things. So if I want to just grab my about, I could still just utilize index1. And now when we console.log this, oh, hello. Go ahead and refresh this. My HTML collection works. I wanted to grab me index1. Interesting. So it looks like this indexing isn't working. All right, we'll dive into how to grab each individual one of them here shortly. So there we'll be able to grab all three of those elements, right? And if we wanted to change something to them, we could actually interact with their CSS, doing something like allies.style dot background color. Let me actually iterate through it for ally and allies. Interesting. So it looks like when you utilize this li item, it actually only returns 3 attributes. So now let's go ahead and console.log each one of them. If I do lis.length, we're getting misbehavior because it's at the very top. I'm going to move the script tag to the bottom. I apologize, everyone.
Is that the example you're talking about? About putting your
Yes.
script stuff at the bottom because it runs before the page loads or something like that?
Exactly. So a lot of people like to place their script tag up at top. And in doing so, what they're trying to do is they are writing their JavaScript code before their entire HTML body even exists. So that's the issue that you're running into. So for example, currently right now, when I was trying to get the link, I was getting 0. That's because it was executing this code before any of the elements named nav item even existed. So in order to avoid that, I'm going to go ahead and place it at the bottom. Now, this asynchronous defer keywords, what they stand for is saying, hey, I want you to run through the script. And if at any point you're getting undefined or you're getting something that would cause an error, I want you to wait. Wait read the remainder of the HTML script, and once it's done rendering, try to come back to this and continue your JavaScript code. But as you can see, it can still cause some misbehavior that we don't necessarily want. So I always recommend, if you're writing straight vanilla JavaScript into your HTML, place your script tags at the bottom. All right, so now that we can see the li's.linked, let me go ahead and actually try to index it now. Yeah, so now when I utilize console.log at li's index 1, we can actually get that nav item that we wanted. And we can interact with it by getting something like its inner text. And there you can see that the inner text of that li item is about. All right. Now there's a couple of other keys here that you can utilize, and we'll cover them here shortly. So there's our ability to grab information by class name. Notice that grabbing information by class name returns a list. Of HTML objects with the same class. Now, if I were to do something like add an ID into one of these, so let's say we do ID of about. Well, now if I wanted to grab let about be equal to document.get element by ID, and I pass about, what do we expect this to return?
A list of one object.
All right, let's go ahead and try it out. Let's console.log about. Well, now when this gets executed, it returns the object right away. Right? And the reason why it returns the object right away is because, again, we need to remember that classes are utilized for multiple HTML elements, where IDs are unique and only utilized for one HTML element. So when our code gets executed, what actually happens is it grabs the one element and it returns that value automatically. Right? That's the one value that will always get rendered. We'll get that list item with all of its information inside of it. All right, let's hear it, Carlos.
So you say IDs are unique. So if you were to put the same ID for two different elements in your document, would that cause an error or would it just cause misbehavior when you're trying to get element by ID? Would it just find the first one and return that?
It wouldn't cause an error within your HTML element. It would cause an error within your JavaScript. So if I were to add here ID of about, now there's multiples of them. If I refresh it, oh, it looks like it only causes misbehavior and then it grabs the very first item. But that would be why we only utilize IDs and ensure that they are unique so that we can make sure that we're not getting any misbehavior from that. Does that answer your question, Carlos?
Yes, sir, it does. Thank you.
Awesome. All right. Let's continue on with our query selectors here. Now we just went over get elements by class. We just went over get elements by ID. You can even get elements by tag names. If I do, let me go ahead and find this, returns a single HTML element. All right. If I do something like let p tags be equal to document.get elements by tag name, I can specify that all I want to grab is my p tags. And here I can console.log the p tags as well, you can see that we return an HTML collection of 2 separate p tags. Right? Both of those paragraph tags were collected. Now let's try to mimic the same behavior. I'm going to say let p tags all over again be equal to document. Oh, dot get. Excuse me. This is going to be query selector all. And what I'm going to grab is my paragraph tags. Now I'm going to go ahead and console.log my p tags again. And there you can see that I get a node list that I have both of my paragraph tags. Well, if they have the same exact behavior, why even have 2 separate tools? Well, query selector all is utilized to grab multiple items, either by tags or by classes. So if I wanted to grab it by a class, I can simply just say, I want you to grab by classes of nav item. And there I can see that I get a node list with 3 items. Now there's a key difference in the way that I utilize get elements by class name and I utilize query selector all. What's the difference in between the argument that was passed on line 43 and the argument that was passed on line 48?
Put a period in front for query selector all.
Yeah, I put a period in front. That's because we know that in CSS, this is how classes are written with a period in front of them. If I have a way to utilize query selector all, there must be a way for me to grab one specific element. Well, I can grab one element by doing such. I can say, hey, about is equal to document dot query selector. Excuse me. So sorry, everyone. And there I can pass in an anchor tag. If I do so, and I go to console.log about, you'll see that query selector brings me the very first instance of that element. Same thing if I were to pass something like nav item. It would just grab the very first element, which in this case it's home. It's not bringing back a list, it's just bringing back the very first instance of the argument that I'm passing into it. In this case, what I want is the ID of about, and now we get our nav item showing me about. And I could do about.inner HTML so that we can see that anchor tag aiming towards about. So there's our different types of selectors. Does anyone have any questions regarding our different selectors and how we can grab specific items from our JavaScript model, or excuse me, from our JavaScript document object model? Let's hear it, Carlos.
If you were to do document.query selector all and then pass it the actual ID, it would just return the same thing, right?
It would return it within a list.
Okay.
Yeah. So if I go p tags and then so it returns the one item, but it returns it nested within a list.
Thank you.
Of course. Any other questions? All right, if there aren't any other questions, now that we understand how to grab information and interact with our document object model, let's go ahead and do a couple of different exercises here. So I'm going to go into index.html here, and I'm going to add a couple of IDs. So here I'm going to add an ID, say first paragraph. Down below, I'll add an ID. Saying second paragraph. For each one of these division tags, I'll go ahead and add a class. Where for each one of these, I'll add a class of saying paragraph container. All right. Now, I want to grab this very first paragraph. How can I do that utilizing the query selectors?
You could just do document query selector P since it'll just return the first one.
All right, let's go ahead and do document dot query selector P. That would return the first one. Okay, awesome. Now, how would I grab the second paragraph?
Selector all index 1.
Selector all index 1. And that does return the second paragraph there. All right. Now, although this works, maybe we can utilize something like select query selector and just pass in the ID, where I can say, hey, I want to grab first paragraph. And then we can see that first paragraph is being grabbed. Now let's go ahead and actually assign this to a variable. And now let's go into what we can do to this first paragraph. Well, I can say first paragraph dot style. That's grabbing the style property from it. And then I can specify that I want to add maybe a background color. And make that equal to, let's go with red. Now you can see that the first paragraph turns red. I could say first paragraph dot style dot color is equal to blue. And now you can see that the text turns blue. I don't really like how that looks, so I'm going to turn it into green instead. And now it can turn into green. I can even go into my first paragraph and change the font size. And there you can see that the font size is now 32 pixels. All of this is happening within JavaScript. If I refresh the page, you're going to see it for a quick split second. It's still going to be solid black with no background color. And then once it gets to my JavaScript, then it will render the styling that I implemented with JS. Oh, it's not even showing it for a split second. All right. Well, now we have our first and second paragraphs. Let's go ahead and see what we can do to manipulate both of those. So I'm going to let paragraph containers be equal to document dot query selector all. And here pass in a paragraph container. All right, so there's a division class that I've utilized. And let's go ahead and console.log that. When I log this, I get two separate divisions. And both of those divisions just show me two containers, right? Okay, great. There's my division. They all hold my paragraph information. Well, I can add some styling into both of them. I can say for and say container. Of paragraph containers. And let's go ahead and console.log the container itself. Okay, so now I have my two division classes showing up there. when I can say container dot style dot border be equal to 2 pixels. I want it to be black and bold, or excuse me, solid. And now both of my containers have a border that have been added to them, which is black and solid. So now I'm interacting with the styling attributes by being able to grab each one of those elements by either utilizing query selector or query selector all. All right. So far, what we've covered is the breakdown of the JavaScript object document object model for HTML. We talked about how the parent to child relationship works and everything breaks down here. We've also created our own example of the document object model. We covered adding a script tag into our HTML document. And we also covered how to utilize different types of query selectors and saw a small capability as far as being able to interact with our HTML document and its purpose. So now at this point, I'm going to go ahead and open it up for questions. Does anyone have any questions over the material that we covered so far? Carlos?
So, if you do, I know you assigned the query selector, you assign it to container or paragraph containers. Um, do you have to iterate through it to change the style, or can you just do in line 42? Can you just do dot style dot border and change it there, or do you have to iterate through?
Yeah, so we console.log the paragraph containers here, and I take a look at it at the JS DOM level. It's not returning to me an actual division element, right? And what I'm trying to access is the style attribute. And that style only belongs to HTML elements. What I have here is a node list. So if I try to do something like, hey, paragraph containers dot style dot background color and make it red, it's going to throw an error. And let's take a look at what that error is. So that error says cannot set properties of undefined setting background color. So it tells me, hey, there is no such thing as a background color or a style that falls inside of that node list that came back from query selector all. And that's the reason why we have to make sure that we iterate through it, because when I iterate through it and I actually grab the independent container is an HTML element that actually holds style and border. Does that answer your question, Carlos?
Yeah, is there, other than doing it through CSS to where you assign, you give it that from the very beginning, is there a way of doing it without iterating through, or you have to iterate through no matter what? Is there like a different, instead of query selector, we're all doing something else?
You can grab it by ID if what we're talking about is styling specifically. You could do it by ID and then just have two separate lines that will do it. So that way you're not iterating, but you would essentially be doing the same thing where you're grabbing each
Gotcha.
element one at a time and then adding the styling.
Okay, thank you.
Of course. All right. Andy, I saw your hand go up earlier.
No, you answered it. Thank you.
Okay, perfect. Keegan?
So when you're using query selector and you're using a dot or a hashtag, that's just telling the query selector look for ID or look for class, right?
Correct.
Okay, just wanted to double check.
All right. Any other questions? Let's hear it, Scotty.
When you use query selector get all by class name, it return an HTML list compared to the query selector all return the node list. Is there any like real difference, or can you still, I don't know.
When it comes to the functionality of how we interact with it, there's not going to be a difference. We're still going to interact with it as if it was just a simple array. When it comes to what's going on under the hood, they work differently. They still collect a list of HTML objects. One of them collects them as HTML objects, while the other one collects them as a linked list. That's the difference as far as why query selector returns a node list, while get elements by tag name return an HTML collection. Does that answer your question, Scotty?
Yeah.
All right, Daniel?
Which one would be preferred, the query selector or going by get element?
Query selector will likely be the most preferred method moving forward. All right. If there aren't any other questions, well, let's actually go into some functionality here, right? I just wrote all of this, but for what? If I wrote all this information and I understand how to interact with the JavaScript DOM, cool, I can mess with some styling, but that's what main.css is for me to create styling. So what does adding JavaScript actually do for me? Well, what it does is it gives me an ability to actually have some dynamic to my sites. So I'm going to go ahead and give this the ID of output, excuse me, to create more of a dynamic site. I'm going to have this as an input. This input will be of type text. I'm going to add a placeholder saying enter your name. And then I'll add an input of type. Actually, let's make this simple and turn this into a button that says submit. Now here's the behavior that we're going to create. When a user types in, hey, my name is Francisco, and they click on the button submit, I want this paragraph tag to show a greeting saying, hello, Francisco. So it's going to be our show greeting function. Currently, I have a p tag that grabs the input. Let's go ahead and add an ID here as well. And let's call this user input. So my p tag is going to show my output or my result. I'm going to grab my user input through my input field. And on this submit is where I'm going to add an event. And we're going to talk about more, we're going to go deeper into events during the second portion of our lecture. But when I click on submit, I want all that functionality to get executed. Grab the user input and display that input within the output of the paragraph tag. All right. So let me go ahead and do some pseudo coding here. So here I'm going to create a function. Inside of this function, I'm going to grab user input. Once I have the user input, I'm going to insert, or excuse me, grab my output element. And then finally, I will insert into output element my greeting message. All right, so first we create the function. So here we have const show greeting. Now we're going to grab the user input. I'm going to say user input be equal to document dot query selector. I'm going to grab user input. And I want to console.log this. I'm going to stop there for now. Now, currently my function isn't being called. And I could just execute my function right at the very end of my script. All right, let's go ahead and say that I add this after line 15. I say show greeting. Well, when I execute this, we can see that what show greeting actually does when I console.log the user input is it's showing me my entire input field. Is that what I want? I see a couple of head nods saying no, right? I don't want my entire input field. I actually want the value that's inside of this input field. So what I'm going to do is at the very end of this user input, I'm going to add dot value. Currently, right now, that returns nothing. And if I type in Francisco, well, it still does nothing. Why is that? I changed the element of my input field, but it's not rendering anything. That's because I'm calling my function right away. And my function is only being called once. What I need to do is I need to create a way for the user to trigger this function. That's where our event comes in. Here in my submit button, I'm going to add an onClick event. And for this onClick event, I'm going to specify that the function that will be executed will be show greeting. Now, if I click here, you'll see that there was something log currently empty into the console. If I type in Francisco and I press submit, now I get Francisco. If I put ditto and I click on that submit button, now we get ditto. All I did here is I said, every time this button is clicked, I want you to trigger the function of show greeting. That's the behavior that we've just created. Let me go ahead and take a pause there and open it up for questions. Does anyone have any questions over what I just did and how we connected that button to our function? All right. If no one has any questions, then let's continue moving forward. The next portion is going to be to grab my output element. And I'll say let output be equal to document dot query selector. And here I'm going to grab my output, which is an ID of output. And then finally, I'll say, hey, I want to insert my output message. So I'll say output dot inner. Let's do inner text be equal to, and I'm gonna do some interpolated string here. Now go ahead and say hello. User input. All right. Again, I type in Francisco, and the moment I click submit, a paragraph tag, which has already been created. I'm not recreating the paragraph tag. I'm just grabbing that paragraph tag and injecting text into it. And the text that I injected is hello, Francisco. I could even go as far as clearing this value that's inside of my function here. Well, what I can say is I can grab the user input element, take off this dot value. All right. Go into user input dot value down here, and then say user input element dot value is equal to an empty parentheses. And now, when a user is interacting with this, they type in Francisco, they click submit. User input is not defined. Interesting. Oh, hello. They click submit. A text gets generated showing that user input value, but then we reset the value of the input element so that it goes back to being empty and is ready to take in more input all over again. All right. Does anyone have any questions regarding the show greeting function? How it works and how we connected it to the user? Go ahead, Daniel.
So instead of adding that to your button, like the click method, would it be better to do add event listener and have the element be attached to that? So element dot add event listener click, and then your function as a second argument.
Add event listener would be better if you're trying to also create an HTML element. So if you created the HTML element within JavaScript, that's when I would utilize add event listener. If the element already exists within your HTML document, then I would just add the element to your HTML document like this.
Thank you.
Of course. Any other questions? All right. Excuse me. If there are no other questions, let me go ahead and pause our recording here. Oh, go ahead, Andy.
Yeah, I was trying to figure out how to ask this. When you're spitting out "Hello, Francisco," how does HTML know where to put it on the DOM?
Got it. So here we have our paragraph tag named output, right? That we gave our ID of output. So it already exists. The paragraph tag already exists. All I'm doing within my function is I'm actually grabbing that output paragraph tag. So this returns the paragraph tag with ID of output. Boom. Once we have that paragraph tag, all I'm doing is I'm saying, hey, I want you to put the inner text inside of it to be set to hello to the input that's coming in from the form, right? I'm not saying I want you to add to the current paragraph tag. I'm not saying that I want you to place it in a specific place inside of the paragraph tag. I'm saying if the paragraph tag does currently hold any value, I want you to change its value to hello Francisco. So here's the paragraph tag, right? If I put in Francisco and I click on submit, this entire lorem ipsum is going to go away and it's just going to show hello Francisco.
Okay. All right. So you do have to give it a real state essentially for that to show up somewhere.
Yeah, you have to give it an element for it to actually render and show up on your screen.
Okay. Thank you.
Of course. All right. Any other questions? All right. Now let me go ahead and pause the recording. All right, welcome back, everyone. Here we're going to go ahead and start part two of our lecture. And in part two of our lecture, we're going to talk about a couple of things such as attaching an external JS file to our HTML document. We're going to talk about creating elements. When we create elements, we're going to talk about adding classes, adding IDs. And we're going to do this by generating cards inside of this card game, inside of my HTML document that you can see here. Once we're done talking about adding event listeners and what is an event, we'll go ahead and dive into propagation and event propagation. And then finally, we'll finish off the second portion of our lecture by talking about forms. All right, let's go ahead and dive right in. So far I have main.css, I have index.html, and main.js. I've written all of my code in JavaScript inside of main.js. Well, that's not necessarily something that I want. I want to actually isolate my code, right? The same way that I isolated all of my design code, I want to isolate all of my JavaScript code. So I'm going to take this function here, and I'm going to take it out of my HTML document and place it inside my main.js document. So now I have a bunch of commented out stuff. Oh, let me go ahead and comment that out as well, because we don't want that to interrupt the browser. All right. Well, now I have main.js, which shows my show greeting. You can see my local server is still running. And if I click Francisco and I submit, well, now nothing's happening. Let's go ahead and inspect. I'm getting that nothing is happening. I come over and I check the console. And when I check the console, I have 4 separate messages. They're all hidden. So let me take a look at the errors here. What's calling me, hey, there's an uncaught reference error. Show greeting is not defined. And it tells me this is happening in my HTML button where I have an event for onClick. All right, well, it's clearly defined, right? It's clearly defined. I can see show greeting here. Well, the issue now is that when I connect to this JavaScript portion, although my button does exist and it's connected to show greeting does not exist within the scope of index.html because it's not connected yet. Just like we have to connect our main.css file, we have to connect our script. And we do so by adding a source. I'm going to say the source here will be main.js. And now that I've added a source, when I go into Francisco, when I click submit, the functionality comes back and everything's being executed. So my script tag takes in a source, my link tag takes in an href. All right. Does anyone have any questions over how to utilize or why to utilize an external script to hold all of our JavaScript? If there are no questions, then let's move on into our next exercise. In this exercise, what we're going to do is we're going to create a set of cards. And let me actually write this here. Oh, hello. So I'm going to create a function that will generate a card element, which will be a division, with a border and a number. Let me actually just put this all inside the same line. All right, so then we're going to generate our card. And when I generate this card, I want to insert card as a child into the card container. All right, so there's a couple of things here. Well, I want to insert into the card container. So if I want to insert into the card container, I also probably want to grab the card container. All right, so let's take a look at this HTML file here. So here I have my card container, which is an ID, and I have a button for being able to generate a card. So the easiest part is being able to grab a card, or excuse me, grab the card container. So let's go into creating our function, generate card. And I'm actually going to make a global scope here named counter. I'm going to start off at 0. And here, inside this function, I'm going to generate a card. All right, this card is going to be a division. I can say let card division be equal to, and now I'm going to dive into the concept of creating an element, utilizing the create element function. Now the create element function simply just takes in a tag. So I can say, hey, I want to create an element, which is a division. And I can add all of my CSS in here. I could say let card div dot style dot border be equal to, and let's go with, oh, what is it that you're not liking? Oh, I apologize. Card div dot style dot border be equal to solid. Let's go with black. And let's make it 2 pixels. We can say card div dot style dot background color. And let's make this gray. Now let's go into card division dot style dot height. Let's go ahead and make the height. Let's set it to a fixed value. Let's go with 10 vmin. And if that's the height, let's do the width to be 5 vmin. All right, go ahead, Carlos.
So if you were to put all that styling into the CSS file, and then instead of indicating all the styling here, can you just give it like, I don't know, tell it the class is, I don't know, card div.
We absolutely
Okay.
can. And that's
Okay, okay.
going to be the second iteration. Awesome. All right. So now we have our card division that we've created. Now we can grab our container there. So I can say card container be equal to document dot query selector and pass in the card container. And then finally I can say card container dot children, or excuse me, since we want to append a child, we can say append child. Remember, it's a list, so we're appending to a list here. And what we're going to go ahead and add is the card division. All right. So disregarding all of the CSS styling that we created in there, all we're doing is we're creating a division and we're inserting said division into this container. Well, now let me go ahead and connect this function here. I'm going to come over to this add a card button. I'm going to say on click. I want to generate card. Let me make sure that's exactly what I called it. Generate card, generate card. All right, now I click on it and there are my cards showing up. All being displayed inside of the card container. All right. And let me do a little bit of CSS styling here to handle that overflow.
The reason those cards are all populating like that nicely is because of that CSS, right?
Yes, that's
Okay.
correct. All right, so there we were able to generate a bunch of cards. Let's go ahead and go through this step by step as to what it is that we're accomplishing, all right? So first, we generate a card element. That card element is simply a division. This division, we're adding some styling into it. The styling that we're adding is where the border is solid, has 2 pixels, where the background is gray, where we have a division height and a division width being added into it. Then we grab the container where the card is going to live, and we simply grab that children array and we append into it the card that we have created. Right? I am creating HTML within JavaScript and adding children to parents. Does anyone have any questions over how we created this function and what this function accomplishes? Let's hear it, Andy.
So it's not about the function itself. I've got a question about how you figured out what the positioning is going to look like within the division, the card container. If we were going to do that same process, what's the best way to approach? Is it to just see what it looks like in the HTML before we put it in JS?
Yeah, so I would go into the index HTML and I would identify, oh, hey, you know what? I have a container here, and this is where I want everything to live. So I would essentially just create a division, add some CSS to that division. So this border that you see here is nothing but CSS. This border that you see here, right? And this entire division has a set width and a set height that I have set inside of my main.css here. Now that I created that, well, now all I need to do is make sure that when I click this add card, it grabs that division and adds all of my cards inside of this division. As far as how everything is coming out nice and clean, it's coming out because of the CSS that I've added inside for that division. Does that address your question, Andy?
Yes, it does.
All right. Awesome. I'm sure there's people following along. So let me go ahead and share this CSS file with everybody so that you have it available to you and you're not trying to just copy my CSS or trying to figure it out as I'm teaching the lecture. All right. So now here we have our JavaScript file. Let's go ahead and add a little bit more into it. Let's say card division dot inner text. And let's make that equal to the counter. And then finally, we'll do counter plus equals 1. Or excuse me, plus plus. Got to get rid of that. And then finally, I'm going to go ahead and do a little bit more CSS here, where I'm going to do style, display, make that into flex. Let's do card division dot style dot align items, make that into center. And then finally, card division dot style justify content and make that into center. All right, quite a bit there just to have our numbers centered. But now we can see our numbers are centered. They're being added in as we expected. And we have all of our cards being generated. All right, awesome. Well, now, again, we want to make sure everything gets isolated. And Carlos earlier brought up the point of not only is this a lot of syntax, but it doesn't seem very efficient. I'm creating all of it through JavaScript rather than actually utilizing the tools that I have, creating a class, and then just adding it to said class. Well, let's inspect one of these elements here. If I go into inspect it, it has all of my CSS added to it inside of the division. And if I notice, we can tell that this division tag of card doesn't have a class set to it. Instead, all of the styling that I'm adding here is being interpreted as inline text or an inline styling, right? Let's fix that. How do I add a class to an element? Well, instead, I'm going to say card div dot class name is equal to card. And now I can take all of the CSS that I've created and create a card. Inside of this card, I want the following. I want a border. I want a background color. We have a height. A width. Oh, this inner text portion, that's going to actually stay within our JavaScript. So let me go ahead and put that there. I have the ability to add a display. I want to specify how to align items. And I also want to specify how to justify content. Now, when I go into main.js, I can get rid of all this. And all I simply need to do is create the card. Let me go ahead and figure out what is going on here because that did not do what I expected. Let's open up this division, take a look at our card holder. All right, so we are getting the class of card being generated in there. So maybe something's going on within my CSS file. Interesting. Hmm. So now it's reading it. Interesting. Let me see if I add another card.
Is it because some of
Do
it's
you have
in
it enclosed?
strings?
Yeah.
So some of
That's the
the
color.
values to the keys you're giving there,
Oh,
like
orange
solid
string.
black 2 pixel, yeah, can you put that in a string or does it need to be non-quoted?
That can definitely be the issue. Let's go ahead and fix that. There you go. Thanks so much for catching that. It was the fact that I was writing my CSS incorrectly while putting everything in string. So there you go. I can still continue adding everything, and while my card is holding all of my class values, and everything is displaying as desired. So I'm able to create cards that have a class and apply CSS that I've created for said class as this element is being generated. Awesome. And then just to make sure, does that address your question, Carlos? All right, I see head nods. Fantastic. So just like I can add a class, I could also add an ID, right? I can say, hey, I can add a function, identify, let's do 7. That will take in an element and then say if element dot inner text is equal to 7, then I want to add an ID. Element ID is going to equal yeah, it's going to equal, and let's call it special. Let's just call it my part. So every time a card is created, I'm going to go ahead and pass it through this identify 7 function, where I'm going to pass the card division. All right, let's go ahead and create our cards here. I go and inspect this element. You can see that now it has the ID of my card. All right, so it has the regular class of card, but it also has the ID of my card. All right, does anyone have any questions over adding classes or IDs? Perfect. If no one has any questions, then let's go ahead and start talking about event listeners here. Oh, go ahead, Nick.
Super basic. Why can you just define counter equals to 1 and you don't need to do like a let or a var or a const or
Yeah, that's a great question. That's just the JavaScript convention, unfortunately. So if I don't specify let or const, it still identifies it as a variable and does variable assignment. It just establishes it by default as a var if not specified
okay.
to be let or const. Yeah. All right. So now I have all of my information. Everything's working great. But I want to go ahead and add a little bit of dynamic user interface here. When I hover over a card, I want to be able to change that card's text. And I want to be able to change that card's color, maybe even its height and width. So let's go ahead and create a function. It's a const on over. And what this function is going to do is it's going to take in an element. This element, I am going to change the color. So I'll go ahead and enter the style. I'll enter the background color. And change it to gold. And then I'll go ahead and change the inner text to be F. Well, let's just go with FA. So that's what I want to happen whenever I hover over a specific card. So I'm just going to rename this and say over card. Well, now when I generate a card, how do I add this event into it?
Our div dot add event listener,
Yeah.
parentheses, the argument on, I guess, hover or whatever it is, comma, your
Mouse
function.
over. Mouse over.
Yeah, so here we're going to do card div dot add event listener, and we'll specify the type of event that we're listening for. In this case, it will be mouse over. Now, mouse over will then conduct a function. And let me go ahead and also pass the event here. I want to console log the event. So now when I call this function, I'm going to go ahead. Currently, I added the event listener of mouse over. I'm going to say over card, which will take in the card division. And it will also take in the event. And actually, it looks like events is already passed into it. So let's go into the console. I'm going to add a card. You can see that it's already being triggered. So that's not necessarily good, right? And the reason why that's happening is because I'm actually calling the element itself. So let me comment these 2 lines of code out. And let's concentrate on the event in itself. Just going to take off this card division process. All right. Now I'm going to add a card, and we can see cards being generated. Now, let's see what happens when I hover over 4. Well, when I hovered over 4, I got a message being logged into the console. Let's take a look here. The message that is logged into the console gives me an object, and it tells me this is a mouse event. Now, for the following mouse event, these are all the key value pairs that I have. So I have, is it trusted? It is. Was there an alt key? This is false. Does it bubble? Yes. Any buttons? No. It gives me the exact location where it was executed in the client side. So it tells me in the x-axis, it was located at 186. In the client axis, it was located at 66. It tells me if it was composed. So that's just height. Client Y is height. Client X is from left to right, so horizontal. All right. And then it gives me quite a bit of information. But the most important thing for me is the target. Where was this event targeted? And it actually gives me the HTML element of the card that triggered this event as the target. So if I were to console.log event.target. So here I go add a card. I hover over the number 1. It gives me that HTML element. It tells me here's the target. Well, now I can say let target be equal to event.target. I can change this to say target.style.background. And I could change this to say target.innertext. So now when I add a card and I hover over, you can see that the card changes the color, turns into gold, and it has FA as the inner text. We can even make our cards bigger. So let's say target.style.height. I believe what we had was originally 10, so let's make it 11. Let's go 12 actually to make it solid. And make the width 6. Now this mouse over, or this event listener, is a function that takes in 2 parameters. One being the type of event, and 2 being the function to execute upon event. So that's how we were able to add an event listener to being able to mouse over and change that card value. So now if I go and create a bunch of cards, and I go straight down the middle row, you can see that all of the cards that I hovered over are turned into gold and change the text from the number numerical value back into FA. All right. Does anyone have any questions over how we were able to add an event listener to this card? Well, just like we have an over card method, we're going to go ahead and create a out of card. Let's just call it off of card. Which again, it is going to take in an event. And I just want to return all of the styling back to its default values. How could I do that? So first, I want to grab the element that triggered the event. Then I want to apply styling. All right, so those are the 2 simple steps there. So for line 18, I want to grab the element that triggered the event. How could I do that, Justin?
Oh, I mean it. So to grab the element that triggered the event, you would get I mean, you'd create a function that um um I'd grab it by ID. I'm sorry.
All right. No problem at all. Let's go ahead and pass it on and let's hear it from Regina.
You'd have to do what you did up top. So you'd say let target is equal to event dot target.
Awesome. And that's going to return the element. So returns the element that triggered the event. All right. And then finally, we'll just apply the styling. Right. So this is the easy part. So we can say style. We can say background color. Turn this back into gray. We can grab the target, grab the height, turn this back into 10, be min, grab the target. All right, give me a second, Alex. Grab the width and turn this back into 5, vmin. All right, go ahead, Alex.
So is the CSS file only called when the card is first initialized and then like never again, pretty much?
So the CSS files still exist. And the CSS is still being rendered, right? Because you can see that as soon as I call this, every time JavaScript creates the element, it's generating the correct CSS file. But I do see your question. So your question is, well, if I have the class, why is it that my inline styling is overriding it? Well, it just happens because of the sequence of things. So when it comes to sequence, right, the first thing that starts happening is index HTML. Oh, hello. So the browser makes a request to the server. In this case, our server is our live server. The server then responds to the browser and says, here's some HTML for you to render. Okay, great. So it says, all right, well, I have a doc type, HTML, all this stuff. And then it hits the link tag and it says, well, what is this? So it goes over to main CSS and loads all the CSS. All right, once it's done loading all the CSS, it goes into the title and it continues working down and it begins to generate all of the HTML that we have created. Finally, at the very end, it creates our button down here, or it creates all of our JavaScript, which we wanted to create. All right. Well, now it has a default behavior, or now the browser knows about these classes, such as card. So when I go to create a card, well, the first thing that gets executed is the JavaScript, right? Oh, there we go. JavaScript generates a card. Great. And it adds a class name. Because I added a class name, the browser now, not main.css, the browser is the one that's tracking this class. The browser then applies the class that I've created. All right. But then I have my mouse over event. Well, when I hover over something in my browser executes the function or off of a card and it disregards the class that I had created. Right? So it's just because of the order that things are being rendered and how the browser is executing things. Does that answer your question, Alex?
Yep. Thank you.
Of course. All right, Andy.
I'm a little confused about the target. So the mouse over is applied to all the cards that are generated, and we need the target to figure out which item was moused over. Is that the purpose of the target?
Yes, that's actually exactly it. So if I go over here and I go over to create a couple of, oh, actually, let me go ahead and add a console.log statement here. All right, so I add a couple of cards. So if I go and hover over the number 7, you'll see I get a mouse event, right? And this mouse event has a key of target that holds the value of the card that holds the number 7, right? Well, every event is unique. They're all mouse over events, but their targets and the location in which they were triggered are different. Right? We can see that every single one of them hold a different value for the location where it was triggered, and therefore the target that triggered them has a different value as well. And that's how we're able to grab the element that triggered the event and apply the CSS or whatever logic we want into that one element. Does that answer your question, Andy?
Yeah, it makes sense. I was just thinking that maybe the keyword target here might change based on, but yeah, that answers my question. Thank you.
Awesome. All right, Michael.
Could you use this like let's see, the off card event to call on main.css instead of rewriting the background color height width to just basically when the event is called, or like, the mouse off event is called, it just reapplies the original style you had to that card?
That's a good question. I actually do not know. Yeah, let me see if I can do something like that. I would assume that I could always just call back the class name and then reset it back to it. Um, again, this is experimental. I actually don't know. Oh, I haven't even attached the event yet. I'll experiment with that once I attach the event,
Okay, thanks.
of course. All right, Aaron.
Yeah, so since each target is unique as you're mousing over them, for the on card, could you potentially throw that in some sort of, or over card, some sort of like while loops, like while uh, the target is the event target, or while mouse over is true, like it does that, and then as soon as your mouse leaves it, it exits that instead of doing two separate ones for on and off.
That's a good question. Let's check it out. Because currently, that should give me my event here. Let's take a look at what my event does. So it gives me is trusted is true. I wonder if it gives me something that shows me if the event is triggered and how long the event is triggered for.
I think there was a timestamp.
A timestamp, yes, but I don't think I could run it off of the timestamp in general. All right, so I'm not seeing something that would give me a true or false, or something that would shift from true to false. So you can see here that I'm hovering it over again and again, and every single time it still shows me pretty much the same values for true and the same values for false. So I don't think I could actually run a while event for something like this. Um, Not in vanilla JavaScript, but definitely could be done in something like React or a separate framework that is handling a virtual DOM at the same time. Does that answer your question?
It does. I was just curious.
Awesome. All right. Well, let's go ahead and apply this off card, right? Currently, I added an event listener for mouse over. Now let's add an event listener for mouse out. So here we have our card division. I'm gonna add event listener. Here I have mouse over. Now I'm gonna do mouse out. That's the type of event. And then for my second argument, I'm gonna add the function to execute, which in this case is off of card. Notice I'm not calling the function. I'm just simply telling it the function to execute. All right. So now I go to add a bunch of cards here. And you'll notice that as I hover over a card and come back off, they go back to their original styling. The only way that I know they've been flipped is because the inner text stays as FA. All right, so I could pretty much create a fun little game with just this much HTML, right? You could create something like a memory game just from knowing this much HTML, CSS, and JS. All right, Carlos.
So I see whenever you hover over it, it changes the value to FA. Is there a way of bringing it back to the original value? Do you have to store it in a variable and on the mouse out kind of pass it back that original value?
You would have to have a way to store that value. So what you can do is maybe pass in another parameter. So what I would say is pass in the event, and then after the event, also grab maybe the old num, right? And I would move this counter down here. So currently when I pass it into my off card, again, I would pass in the event, and then I would pass in the, what do we call it? Counter. There you go. So now if I go into, oh, hello. What happened to my button? Why is my button doing that? Hey, you, get back.
Is it because you're passing the event into it? Doesn't it by default pass the event?
It does by default pass the event, but I'm wondering why my card button is acting weird. So there's FA. Oh, it's causing an error. Let me see what error is coming up here. Oh, it's not even telling me an error. So if by default it passes the event, can I take off the counter then? Nope, that's already. Cannot read properties of undefined style. Right, let me give it a second. Let me give it a little look over here. So that seems to be breaking even my button. I would have to figure out how I can pass in an extra parameter in there. I don't know it off the top of my head, but there is a way to pass in multiple arguments in there. Let me see if I can do
Okay.
it this way.
But it would eventually go that there's no like function to kind of revert to the previous that you have to pass in a variable or another. Yeah.
Yeah, so I guess I can do it like this. Um, and then I could take the entire body there. And instead of old number, just turn it back into the counter. Oh, but it's turning it back into the last value of the counter. See how they're all turning into 29 now? That's because counter is currently a global scope, which is 29. So there would have to be a way of storing it separately. Essentially, when this event is triggered, the current value of counter is no longer
What it
is
was when the button was made or the card was
exactly.
made. Yeah.
Yeah, so you would have to have a separate value for being able to store it.
Okay. All right. Thank you.
Of course. All right. And then I think there was one more thing that I wanted to experiment with. Oh, that's right. Adding a class here. So let's go ahead and add the card. Boom. Good enough. No, so it looks like even if I just called the class back in itself, it wouldn't recall the CSS values. Um, I'm sure there's a way to revert CSS, but I just don't know it off the top of my head. I think that was Aaron that asked that question. I might be wrong. Um,
That was
but
me, but it was cool to try out.
awesome. All right, go ahead, Carlos.
Could you just create another class named hover card and give it that property? And so whenever you hover over it, it changes the class to that one. Whenever you move out of it, it changes the class back to the original card class.
Let's see. Let's do out of card.
Well, the out of card would be the just dot card. So you would do the on card is when you change the color to it or to
Oh,
change
I
the
see. And
style
then just change the classes back and
and then
forth.
just bring it back to card whenever you go off card.
We probably can do that. Let's do that. Okay, let's do on card and do height. Here, what we wanted was 12 vmin. Let's do width, where the width was 6 vmin, and where the background color was. All right, and let's go into main.js. For overcard, we're just gonna change it. We're gonna do target dot class name be equal to on card, which I believe that's what I named it. Let me make sure. Yep, that's what I named it. So let's add a couple.
And then off card would just bring it back to, you got to set the tag name again or the
And
class name.
then when I come back down,
Oh,
we'll
that's
change it back to card. All right. Boom. Yep, that works. That was a good way of doing it.
The
Good
text isn't
idea.
set in the CSS file though, so it's still FA.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah.
The text doesn't change, but the styling did. All right. Awesome. So there's our card example. We have a pretty good understanding about events now. So the next thing that we're going to talk about is something called event propagation. So here, I have two simple boxes, one inside of the other. We have our green box, which is our inner, and we have our red box, which is our outer. And I'm just going to add a couple of events into them. So I'm going to say I have a function saying say hello. This function will console.log hello. And then I have a function say goodbye. And this function is going to console.log goodbye. I'm going to add both of these. I'm going to say, hey, on click, I want you. Why did you do that? This new class. So on click, I want you to call, say hello. And for my inner, on click, I wanted to call, say goodbye. All right. Now let's take a look at our console here. I'm going to refresh the page. I'm going to click on our red box on the outer box. We expect it to say hello. And there we get hello on my console. Well, now if I click on the inner box, you'll notice that I get both messages of goodbye and hello. Well, what's actually happening here is both of the events are being triggered because in reality, I'm clicking not only the inner box, but I'm also clicking the outer container, right? The container that is holding that outer box is being clicked. And that's how I'm getting this information. If I want to make it a little bit more obvious, I can come up to my CSS here. Oh, doesn't seem like I have anything for outer, so let me go ahead and add that in there. All right, so if I want to make it a little bit more obvious, now we can see that the green box is actually inside of the container, right? There's no doubt that the green box lives inside of our container. Well, when I click the red box, which is my outer layer, only one event is being triggered. When I click the green box, both layers of outer and inner are being clicked, and I'm getting that goodbye and hello. This is called event propagation because it's propagating amongst the different layers of the event. Well, how do I stop that?
Was it the bubbling?
Yeah, it was the
The
stop
bubbling?
propagation function.
Yeah, there's actually a stop propagation function. And let me go ahead and make sure that I have the correct syntax for it. The way that I do this is I'm actually going to pass in the event inside of my HTML into both of these functions. And in JavaScript, I'm going to account for the event in both of these functions. All right. Now the question is, well, what is propagating, right? Because hello isn't necessarily propagating. What's being propagated is to say goodbye. So I'm going to say event.stop propagation. And I think I spelled that correctly. All right. And in doing so, when I go ahead and send my event, so here I click on outer, I get hello. When I click on inner, the only output that I get is goodbye. I am stopping the propagation to go into the outer layer. Everything is being withheld within that inner layer. All right. So the key thing to make sure that it's highlighted here is the stop propagation must be added to the child event, not the parent. Right? Our parent event would be say hello, where our child event was say goodbye. Our parent division holds the function say hello, where our child element division holds say goodbye. Does anyone have any questions regarding propagation? All right, awesome. If no one has any questions, then let's move on into the final portion here. The last thing we're going to talk about is how to work with forms. So I'm going to create a new division here. And this division is going to hold a form. Inside of this form, I'll go ahead and take an input of type text with a placeholder that will say enter your favorite Pokemon. I'm going to close that off. And I'm going to take an input of type submit. Now, a little bit of different functionality here. And I can just name this, give it an ID of form container. All right, so there's my ID. I have my form. I see a question from Andy. Go ahead, Andy.
Could you just give me a quick explanation for the input type submit and the difference between that and the submit button?
Absolutely. Yeah, so a submit button is just a button. We gave it some functionality, but in reality, it's just a button that I can click on as many times as I want. It doesn't really do anything unless I specify some functionality. Now, when it comes to a form expects you to be able to submit information. It doesn't necessarily have to hold the label of submit. We can change the value of saying enter, and it will show enter instead of submit. But the functionality of this input field is to work with the form to submit the entire form. Now, what does that mean? That means that I can work with the form and write things like ditto. And as soon as I press enter, and actually, let me give this a name here. Favorite Pokemon. All right. So here I'm going to place ditto. And as soon as I press this enter button, you'll see that my browser kind of refreshed. And now in my URL pattern, I have this question mark saying, hey, I received some arguments with key value pairs where the key is favorite Pokemon. That's the name that I gave that input field. And the name is ditto. So input type submit works with forms to have this reaction when the form is submitted. And it has an on-click functionality already built. The on-click is submitting the form, whereas a button is a button without any default functionality. I have to myself assign it an on-click event. Does that answer your question, Andy?
Yeah, yeah, and that's interesting. You talk about name. So name would be the key, and the value would be whoever what the user inputs. Okay,
Awesome.
thank you.
Of course. All right. But now let's talk about how we would actually handle this submission. Well, let's take a look here. I'm going to add a bunch of cards. When I add all of these cards inside of my browser, you can see that they're all being rendered and they have their own independent values, right? Well, when I click enter, what happened to all of my cards? My cards are gone now, right? Why is that?
The page refreshed.
Yeah, there was a new request. When I submitted my form, a request from the browser was sent to the server for index.html. And everything got re-rendered all over again, right? So we talked about this communication. Nope. Here. And then maybe not here. Nope. Let's try this one. There you go. We talked about this communication here. My browser, which is Chrome, is making a request to the server, which in this case it's live server, for index.html, and rendering this JS DOM. All right. So I need to stop that request from being sent over and over again. Well, let's create a function that will handle this information. So create a function to handle form submission. This function should stop the request for index.html. All right, and then we'll add more into it as we move forward. So here we'll go into const handle submit. The submission of a form is an event. And what this function will do is it will stop the browser from sending a request to index.html. Well, we're going to do that by preventing the default behavior that comes in from the submission event. Now let's connect the dots. I go into index.html, and at the form, I'll say on submit, I want to trigger the function called handle submit. And again, I want to pass in the event. Well, now I can put ditto, press enter. You'll notice that nothing changed. I can add a bunch of cards. Let me refresh the browser here. Let me take off this URL pattern and just go to HTML. Add a bunch of cards, put ditto. And when I press enter, nothing happens. I was able to stop the default behavior from the browser. Well, now what do I do with all of this data? What was the point of even grabbing this information? Notice that I didn't give it an ID this time, right? So I can't just do query selector by ID, and I definitely don't want to iterate through the entire JavaScript. Well, when this event gets submitted, it also comes in with a form, right? Let's go ahead and console.log that event.target. So I'm going to go ahead and put ditto and enter. And there I get my event.target, which is just my entire form all together. Well, this is an HTML element, not necessarily something that I can work with to do a lot of code inside of JavaScript. But it is very common to work with forms inside of HTML and JavaScript. So there's a new data structure called form data. So now I can say const form data is equal to new form data. And for those of you who did OOP in JavaScript as well, you'll know that form data is actually a class, and what we're creating here is an instance of the class form data. And it gives me a hint. In its constructor, it's telling me the only thing that I need is the form itself, because my submitter has a default value of null, or it could be null. So all I need to pass into it is the actual form itself. And I do that by passing event.target. And now let's take a look at what comes back from form data. I press ditto, I enter, and now I get an object. And it tells me, hey, this is a prototype of form data. And if I open it up, it gives me a bunch of functions, it has values inside of it. Still not something that I can actually work with just yet. So I need to transform it one more time. Now, what I'm going to do is I'm going to say const form object, and I'm going to turn it into an object by grabbing the entries that are inside of form data. So now let's go ahead and take a look at form object. Again, I do ditto, and I enter. And now what I'm getting is an object that I can work with where the name is now a key and the value that was inside of the input field is now a value named ditto. All right. Does anyone have any questions over how we were able to grab this form, stop the default behavior, and then grab the data out of the form? Let's hear it, Andy.
So we stopped it from being sent over to wherever, right? So we personally are grabbing this information for ourselves. Is that how it works?
Right. So this is in the case, what we're mimicking here is a single page application, right? Meaning that we're not sending requests to the server to grab different index templates or any more HTML templates. Since we don't want that, we're stopping the default behavior. That's why it's not included in the URL pattern anymore. And we're capturing it ourselves here on line 5 and 6.
Okay, and then my second question was for the form data and the event target, just the relationship there, that wouldn't change, right? It's like if I had another input line, it would you still use the same syntax as you did here, new form that data event dot target, or how would that work if there was another line?
Yeah, that would still work exactly the same. So if I were to add another input field, and let's do input type, and I think we could do check here. Yeah, checkbox. And let's say that oh, hello, that the value here is something like, oh, I don't know, is awesome. Oh, I think I have to add a label. This is going to be a little bit way more complicated than what we need it to be. So let me go ahead and change that up. Let's do an input type text and do name, make favorite type, and then add a placeholder saying enter your favorite type. And we close that off. Well, now we have two of them, right? I could have ditto and I could put in here electric.
Wrong answer.
And then when I send this, now you have your favorite Pokemon object that has both favorite Pokemon and your favorite type. Does that answer your question, Andy?
Yeah, yes, it does. Thank you.
Awesome. Well, now we have this information. Let's finish off our function, right? We're able to capture this, and we have an index, something that's called an ID form container. So let's just go ahead and finish it off by saying, hey, let's grab that container. So let container be equal to document dot select, or excuse me, query selector, and pass in that container, which let me remember what I named it. Named it form container. So let's go into our form container. I'm going to create a list here where I'm going to say ul is equal to document dot create element ul. And then I'm going to iterate through our object. I'm going to say for let key of form object. So now I'm just going to console.log that key so I can see it. All right, let me take a look at ditto, electric. I enter. I get an oncaught. So it's telling me form object is not iterable there. So I believe that's because I'm utilizing the of
Of
instead of in. So let me go ahead and run that again. Ditto and electric, we run it, and now I get favorite Pokemon and favorite type. So now I can say, all right, well, and list item is equal to document dot create element list item. And I can say list item dot inner h or inner text be equal to where we do the key. And then we do form object at. Finally, I'm going to do ul dot append child, add the list item, and at the very end, grab the container and append child to add the unordered list. So now I do ditto, do electric. When I click enter, I get my favorite Pokemon is Ditto, and my favorite type is electric. All right. The loop is closed, and that is how we work with forms. Does anyone have any questions regarding working with forms? Perfect. If there are no questions, that's going to conclude our lecture. I'm going to go ahead and stop our recording.